was hosting the open mic nights on Monday nights at a place in Athens, Georgia called Wishbone's Barbecue. You know, Colonel Bruce came through all the time, and Larry Keel came through all the time, and String Cheese pulled up in their bus before they were anything. And Dave Matthews, just by himself, got snowed in there one night and played till, I mean, just crazy stories of 97, 98 era, and then it burned to the ground. And the stage was just a couple of 4x8s thrown in front of the fireplace. One of the folks that came through there around 96, 97 was became a good friend of mine and a teacher, Bill Ayuso, now goes by Billy Ayuso, and he's been in New Orleans for 20 something years now. And at the time he was in Athens and had a funk band called the Brides of Jesus. And he befriended Russell Batiste, and Russell became Bill's best friend and drummer on two of his albums before Bill eventually moved to New Orleans full time. And I was lucky enough to host open mic night and get these guys in to be kind of the house band. That was just amazing for me. And one night their bass player didn't show up, and I'd been playing Beatles songs and pop music, and I was skilled McCartney Rickenbacker, but I wasn't a Chris Squire Rickenbacker yet at that point. Yeah, so I got to sit in with these guys who were way beyond my league. And I was 24 or 25 years old, something. And Russell Batiste basically taught me how to funk. And Russell ended up being a huge influence on me. And long story shorter, Russell Batiste turned me on to Ethiopian Nights as being the bridge between bebop, psych jazz, Miles Davis, and the world of the Headhunters.
This week's request comes from Jonathan Spencer, and he suggested Ethiopian Nights by Donald Byrd. This marks the first time that the person requesting the album has their own page on IMDb. Man, if you were thinking he looked familiar, it's almost certain you've seen something he's been in.
How do you feel? I'm worried about the turtle flu.
Turtle flu.
Turtle flu.
My parole officer says that if your heart goes pitter-patter, then it's true love. Otherwise, you're probably just stalking someone.
I've had my fill in your mouth, Harry. I will bust your ass down the traffic cop!
Don't be a dick, dude. Fucking wear it.
Dr. Rick Schaefer?
My brother-in-law over at St. Mary's Hospital. He specializes in facial reconstruction.
You're looking to hire a clown.
Plus, he's a pretty badass bass player. How cool is that? It's also the first time I get to spend some time with a Blue Note album from my series, which is tremendously exciting for me, especially considering that I'm already a fan of this era and this style of jazz. The very next album Donald Byrd recorded after Ethiopian Nights is Blackbird, and that one I know really well. And just in general, I'm a fan of Donald Byrd's work going all the way back to the mid-50s when he was part of Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, with Hank Mobley, Horace Silver, and Doug Watkins. Great band. Plus, he's recorded with Herbie Hancock on My Point of View, with John Coltrane on Lush Life, with Wes Montgomery on Going Out of My Head, Sam Rivers, Dimensions and Extensions, not to mention close to 50 albums as a band leader himself, spanning from 1955 to 1991. He's got quite the discography. But honestly, the most exciting thing for me is this era in jazz, the 1969 to 1975 period. It's something that I feel very strongly about. That confluence of modal jazz, soul jazz, rock, and funk, using electric instruments and often using psychedelic sensibilities. That which eventually coalesced into fusion. This is something I can talk about for hours. Okay, short intro this week because I'm anxious to get started. So here's a bit more of my conversation with Jonathan while I listen to Ethiopian Nights for the first time.
So the summer of 1969, and then they recorded it in the summer of 1970 and released the following year. Bebop and hard bop was dying, and Donald Byrd was like, I'm not going to die with bop, right? And Miles Davis had two huge records out, In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. By stretching the boundaries of jazz into funk and fusion and inventing a genre that wasn't even there yet, and borrowing the guitar from James Brown, but sitting in a silent way and keeping it melodic instead of modal, And now Miles is like, well, fuck you guys. You just made it even better, right? Now we can dance to it. So that's what makes it funky. Because you can't really, you can dance to it a silent way, but it depends on if you have good mushrooms or something, just depends, right? But you can definitely, a baby can dance to Ethiopian Nights. It booty shakes.
Oh, hell yeah. If you're a fan of Live Evil by Miles, if you're a fan of Live at the Lighthouse by Grant Green, Crossings by Herbie Hancock, you need to check this one out. Before we get into a discussion of the music, let's first talk personnel. First, the rhythm section. Ed Green on drums, Wilton Felder on bass. Ed Green is the drummer on Love Will Keep Us Together by the Captain and Tennille. He did some double drumming with Narada Michael Walden on Jeff Beck's Wired album. He's on the first album by the Sparks. He recorded with Lee Ritenour, Three Dog Night, Steely Dan, and Wilton Felder. He's responsible for one of the greatest bass lines in history. Plus, Live at the Lighthouse by Grant Green, For Every Man by Jackson Browne, even Private Dancer by Tina Turner. And together, they were the rhythm section for a bunch of things, including Dreamer by Bobby Blue Bland.
Ain't no love in the heart of the city.
But the connections don't end there, because on organ on Ethiopian Nights is Joe Sample. And Wilton Felder and Joe Sample were both founding members of the Jazz Crusaders, which later became just the Crusaders. Plus, they both appear on The Art of Tea by Michael Franks.
But I wrote this song instead, and I call it Popsicle Toes.
And Joni's Court and Spark.
I was a free man in Paris. I felt unfettered and alive.
The second keyboardist is Bill Henderson III, who played with Eddie Harris, Pharoah Sanders, Hugh Masekela, Roy Ayers, also a bunch with both vibraphonist Bobby Hutcherson and saxophonist Harold Land. And both of them also appear on Ethiopian Nights. Trombonist Thurman Green played a bunch with Gerald Wilson, but also Jean-Luc Ponty, Ella Fitzgerald, Bobby Womack, Dr. John, and he appears on Natalie Cole's Unforgettable album. For guitars, we have Greg Poree, David T. Walker, and Don Peake. David T. Walker also worked on the Jackson 5 recordings, and Don Peake is responsible for one of the most copied guitar intros ever. And here's something you might not expect. Don Peake also did the music for, of all things, Knight Rider. And finally on percussion is Bobby Hall. And here is just a teeny fraction of some of the hits she's appeared on.
Freedom is just another word for anytime she goes away. Diamond girl. If only you believe like I believe, baby. There's only you and me and we just disagree. Sings a song, sounds like she's singing.
Yeah, she's no joke. So, given all that, let's start with the premise that this band is immense. There are only 3 songs to talk about on Ethiopian Nights. Basically 2 sidelong jams, and squished between them is a pretty little radio-friendly composition. The first of the jams is The Emperor. The bass line and the groove feel very much like late 60s soul jazz. Something from Dr. Lonnie Smith or Stanley Turrentine or Lou Donaldson. But while the drums, percussion, bass, and both guitars are either comping or playing composed parts, both keyboardists and the vibraphonist are adding freely improvised textures. The organ in short stabs, and the Rhodes and vibes in sheets of sound over the top. Then we get an 8-bar melody played by the horns, Donald Byrd, Harold Land, Thurman Green. It's a languid, well-harmonized melody in the natural minor. It immediately elevates the underlying funkiness to something a lot more regal and melancholy. But once Donald Byrd starts improvising, he goes right for that natural 6, playing around with several semitone phrases, right? Like the 6th to dominant 7th, like Miles does on In a Silent Way. But also minor to major 3rd and even tritone to perfect 5th. But like all of Donald Byrd's playing, it's lyrical and articulate, walking that line between his heroes of Clifford Brown and Miles Davis. Next soloist is Bobby Hutcherson, and hearing a full vibraphone improvisation in this context is very cool. It kind of sneaks up on you. Makes you realize he's always been there, comping chord figures in the background. He takes things much further out than Bird, playing inventive and sometimes downright atonal melodies. And then when Harold Land takes over, the melodicism and dexterity suggests Wayne Shorter just a bit, but also like Sunny Fortune from the Agartha Pangea albums. There's just a bit of a solo from the Rhodes as the song transitions into Jamie, the sweet little 3.5-minute hit single. The descending diatonic organ and guitar at the beginning gives off hints of whiter shade of pale. But the changes are much more inventive than that. If anything, I'm reminded of Herbie Mann's cover of If by Bread on his 1971 Push Push album, the one with Duane Allman, featuring one of the most uncomfortable album covers of all time. And lastly, the entirety of side 2 is The Little Rosti. According to Wiktionary, Rosti is the Finnish word for an X mark. Starts with some melodic drums, then a fiercely funky groove established by drums, bass, guitar, and percussion. Vibro slap even. Some slick guitar improv, then sax, then organ, all solid. And Donald Byrd's trumpet solo. This is why trumpet-led fusion and soul jazz always works so well. Because when you have the churning groove created by drums, bass, guitars, organ, Rhodes, vibes, and percussion, the timbre of the trumpet just has the ability to slice right through all of it. A single well-played note is all you need to amplify everything by like 300%, which makes what happens at the end of the song even cooler. Because after a fuzz bass solo, and may I remind you, fuzz bass is never not cool, Donald Byrd comes in again, this time with reverb and delay, holding the 7 but resolving to the minor 9. And as I said right at the beginning, hell yeah! Look, this album rules. This is exactly my kind of album. But we ain't done yet. I get to listen to this a bunch more. Who knows, maybe I'll burn out on it after a week. Not likely. Anyway, a bit more with Jonathan, and I'll be right back with my reflections after a week of listening.
There is a quote inside the album that's in one of the original releases, and I just became aware of this today. So I hope I credit this correctly, but I just thought this is too good for, white boy in Georgia to take credit for it. I can't do it. This is for Byrd himself, right? And it said, soul music is born of the Black American desire to celebrate life despite every effort to render us lifeless, literally and figuratively. Soul music is the sound of hope.
Sometimes things turn around, don't they? I mean, when Dylan went electric, they hated it. 60 years later, and he's now the only rock musician to have ever won a Nobel Prize. So it can happen. But I don't know. There seems to be something in particular about this era in jazz history. Honestly, I don't understand the thinking at all. Warning, rant incoming. Miles comes out with On the Corner, and people accuse him of selling out, accuse him of trying to be radio friendly, trying to appeal to the FM crowd. But let me ask you something. When in history have you ever turned on a pop or rock music station and heard a 20-minute instrumental that featured trumpet, bass clarinet, sitar, and tabla, and a melody that sounded anywhere near as weird as this one? How on earth is that selling out? Is it the electric instruments that made him a sellout? Well, Joe Zawinul played a Rhodes on Cannonball Adderley's Mercy, Mercy, Mercy in 1966. Organ trios have been around since the 50s, and Charlie Christian was playing an electric guitar in the 30s. Is it because jazz began experimenting with rhythmic concepts that weren't strictly based on swing? Well, Afro-Cuban and Bossa Nova have both been mainstays of jazz since the 40s, and neither of them employ a skip beat. Is it because the improvisations stretch out for so long? That they jam over simple groove or a single chord, sometimes for an entire album side? Well, Ornette Coleman's Free Jazz came out in 1961 and the entire album is a single song with no chords at all. But surely it's because of the effects, right? The swirling chorus, like on a Leslie speaker, or the wah-wah, like trumpet and trombone mutes have been used since time immemorial. So what is it? What made early fusion so problematic for so many people? Here's what I suspect. Jazz and blues parted ways about 100 years ago. During that time, jazz has seen a steady increase in sophistication through swing, bebop, cool, hard bop, free jazz, modal. Meanwhile, blues went on to inspire R&B and eventually rock and roll. And I think that reintroducing the less sophisticated sounds of this fad called rock and roll into our thoroughly curated, sophisticated art form seemed unthinkable to a lot of people. And unfortunately, I think there are still a lot of jazz gatekeepers out there. No, not just jazz, music gatekeepers. For popular culture at large, both fusion and prog are shorthand for unappealing music for nerds. And I'm sorry, but if you're in my presence and intimate anything of the sort, expect some pushback from me. Yep, spending a week with Ethiopian Nights has hardened my resolve because this is great music. But most of you will never listen to it because you've been taught that long instrumentals are bad for whatever reason. Somehow, 3 or 4 minutes of a good groove is okay, but more than that, and it becomes bad for some reason. Hell, some of you will play the same 3 or 4 minute song on repeat for an hour. But heaven forbid that one song reach 6 minutes. Okay, I'm done ranting. Thank you. Final thoughts. Scale of 1 to 10, I give Ethiopian Nights 90 episodes of Knight Rider.
A shadowy flight into the dangerous world of a man who does not exist.
See you next week.